But we got to start really with the news of the week. That's Robinson Cano. He gets suspended for the entire 2021 season after he tests positive for PEDs now a second time in his career. And all I can think about is how ill-fated the Robinson Cano experiment was to go and trade for the 36-year-old, how this thing was a disaster of massive proportions, every angle of it, and now it somehow just found a way to be an even worse acquisition. And that makes me feel happy to know that the executive who brought him in is no longer in the building.
I think the only way the Cano thing can get worse is if Jared Kelenic becomes a stud in Seattle, or if Justin Dunn comes through. Oh my goodness. No, but you bring up a good point. And the funniest thing is, what I was sitting there say, okay, Cano, the first words I read were Cano tested positive. And immediately I thought COVID.
Right.
And I read the headline and I'm sitting there. I'm like, wait a minute. The Mets are fine. Because it's just move McNeil down to second and figure out the outfield. Or, I mean, there's a bunch of different options you could go through, and we'll get into that later. But the Mets are okay. I mean, you think about last season, and I'd read a story in the Post that Joel Sherman wrote, where basically he said that Major League Baseball did next to no PED testing last year. So you think about how Robinson Cano was maybe able to hit 300. But like they'll be okay. And they have an owner now who, if he just wanted to eat the last 3 years of that contract, if that was what he wanted to do, he could just do it. So look, this is, if we were having this conversation last year, I would have said, oh no, this is really bad for the Mets. But if you were to pick anybody to lose, as terrible as this sounds, probably go with Robinson Cano. And I think the Mets will be okay. They've got guys that could put it second, namely Jeff McNeil. I think they'll be just fine.
Yeah, I think that is the take here, is that, this news broke and I didn't really wince. I think he's been not a good contributor. The only time he hit 300 was now when he was on the performance enhancer. So I wasn't under any belief that he was going to be a big part of this team. We know that the core of this team is Peter Alonso, Jeff McNeil, Michael Conforto offensively. It's not Robinson Cano. I mean, you have to have other pieces, and you have to have somebody who could play a good second base. I don't even know that he does that well anymore. So I think this actually opens up the infield for the Mets. I mean, you're right about McNeil going to second base. It's the Mets think that that's actually where he's best with his glove. But this is a free agent market that I expect the Mets to be active in. Talk about a DJ LeMahieu, but then talk about the trade market of Francisco Lindor. We're going to talk about those guys a little later. As easy, they could easily plug that hole. They will be improvements. And then the other side of this is just that when this happens a second time to an athlete, I think Robinson Cano joins a pretty small group. I could be wrong about that. That's arbitrary, but not a lot of guys test positive and they make the mistake and it's forgivable. And I think it's now an 80-game suspension that baseball hands down for the first offense. But baseball upped their punishments a couple years back. This is the second time you're done for the year. A third time you're banned for life. For a guy to test positive twice, he moves pretty far down my list in terms of the respect. Robinson Cano building a Hall of Fame career, an absolutely outstanding player. It's really a shame to see. It's really disappointing. I don't want to slap him on the wrist, and because he's going to get a real slap on the wrist of $24 million that he won't be making this season. But it's just a shame to me.
It is. I should also mention, you talk about the small group Robinson Cano enters testing positive twice.
Yeah.
Another member of that group came in second place to buy the Mets. So that's part of this discussion. Most guys, they're out of the game. Alex Rodriguez did it and he was fine. I will also mention this. The Mets are obviously not in penny pinching mode anymore, but I feel compelled to bring this up. So Robinson Cano would have gotten $24 million this year. The Mets got off the hook for all of that. And the Mariners still had to kick in $4 million as part of the agreement. That goes to the Mets. So you think about what the Mets have done this offseason, and really the big move, kind of the only really big move, was Marcus Stroman so far, accepting the qualifying offer. They just got Marcus Stroman for free. Like that's how you have to look at this if you're a Mets fan. Is yes, I mean the finances are not the concern that they were under the Wilpons, but you were just able to pick up a guy who could be a shot in the arm for a starting rotation that was absolutely terrible last year for free, and actually gained money on the transaction. I think that's good business. So you'll take that if you're the Mets. In like a sick and backwards and bizarre way, this actually works out really, really well for the New York Mets. So Robinson Cano tests positive. It's an embarrassment. He ought to be ashamed of himself. We're in agreement on that. But beyond that, the Mets are like, okay, we'll take the $24 million. That's fine. So I think they woke up, they saw that, and they said, okay, we got some options here.
As far as an executive, because this is an interesting conversation that I think is worth touching on. Theo Epstein is a free agent, if you will. And he says he's sitting the year out. I believe that. I think that's probably true. Sandy Alderson wants to hire a baseball man, a top baseball man. My perspective on this is Sandy is older. And even at the end of his Mets days, he actually got sick and thank God recovered. But he seems like someone who wants to leave the Mets with a great baseball infrastructure and have a successor. So whoever they hire as president of baseball operations, I think inherits Sandy's role as not just baseball ops president, but team president.
It's like, well, all right, well, if you hire Theo as your team president, and we'll see what the Mets wind up doing, and they've been linked with certain candidates like Mike Chernoff, Michael Hill from the Marlins for president of baseball ops, and then that person would hire a GM. Like it's a big, kind of like Dodgers style model.
Right.
I don't know who they will get for that. I think Sandy is interesting because, like you said, he's older, and he's the team president of communications of everything basically. Right. So he is not handling the day-to-day baseball stuff. He wants to hire somebody else to do that.
Yep.
How long is he in that job? I don't know. I mean, it depends because it seems like he's delegating a lot of stuff, and I don't say that in a bad sense. I think delegating is good.
Yeah.
And you saw his opening press conference after Steve Cohen talked. I saw it. That's the happiest I've ever seen him. Yeah. Like he was ecstatic. Like you could tell being with the Mets the first time around, and he was basically foisted upon the Wilpons by Major League Baseball because things were going so bad with the Mets at that time. And you could tell it was wearing on him then. He came back. He's cracking jokes with people. Like they would call on a reporter to ask a question, and he'd be like, Roddy! Like he, had just seen that guy for the first time in years. It was really cool to see. But I think he's going to be – I would be surprised if he's maybe in that role for a few years. I think Theo Epstein, I look at the jobs for him in the next offseason, I think Philadelphia actually makes a lot of sense. It's a little frightening, but I do think that out of the places that need a Theo Epstein, Philadelphia is probably at the top of the list. And, I would be surprised to see them get a guy like that. They spend stupid money. Their owner literally said that 2 off seasons ago. And he could be the guy for there. But it's still cool to think about, a guy like Theo Epstein with the New York Mets, given his track record with the Red Sox and the Cubs and getting cursed teams back to the promised land. So I think it's very interesting to dream. I'm just a little skeptical that that's going to wind up happening.
I want to ask you about what the Mets could potentially do this offseason. There's a lot. Top of my list personally is Trevor Bauer. I think this rotation needs another right-hander to pair with Jacob deGrom and Noah Syndergaard when he's healthy. The rotation has actually become a liability. The back end of the rotation, they went and they tried to plug a nosebleed with Michael Wacha and Rick Porcello, and it was ill-fated from the start. Trevor Bauer would be just the right move. And Sandy Alderson even leaned into it a little bit. Bauer leaned into it a little bit. I could see it as a really good marriage.
Top of my list, Chris, you talked about Trevor Bauer. He'd be great to get, don't get me wrong. Top of my list is Francisco Lindor. You have an opportunity. Yes, you would have to give up some capital to get him. The Mets have the money now where if they trade for him, they can do what the Dodgers did with Mookie Betts and then extend him and give him a huge deal for 10 or 12 years, whatever it winds up being. And this is a guy who is a generational talent. The Mets have not developed a player this good recently. I mean, maybe David Wright in his prime, but this is a guy, unbelievable talent, game changer at a franchise level at the shortstop position. You know, you'll probably have to trade either Rosario or Jimenez or both to get him, which obviously is not what you would want to do, but hey, you gotta, at some point, you just got to go ahead and do it. And the Mets need guys like that. And this would be a huge splash right away to get one of the best hitters in the league, one of the best defensive shortstops in the league, lock him down to that big contract, and get another great bat in the middle of your lineup, in addition to all the guys you already have.
And it's interesting, if you're Cleveland, or let's say you're Colorado and you're on the other side of this hypothetical, who are you asking for? Are you demanding Jimenez, or are you asking for Rosario? I think I'm demanding Jimenez in this case. I think he actually carries more value than Rosario at this point, who has a big league track record, and it doesn't jump off the page. I mean, I do think there's a distinction between these two prospects, because Rosario was a much bigger deal. You said he was the top prospect in baseball. He was. It was him and Gleyber Torres. And look what Gleyber Torres has done. I mean, he looks like he's on pace to be an MVP one day. That is just not the story with Amed Rosario. And to me, actually, frankly, the most disappointing part about his game has been his glove, because we heard so much about his glove. We even heard that he might hit for power in the big leagues, hasn't done that. But worse than that, he was supposed to play a very good shortstop. And there have been times where the Mets have had to think about shifting him on the infield, or even teaching him center field, because he just has not had a very good shortstop glove. And I don't want to rip him, because I think he hit 288 in 20. I think he hit almost 290 in the year prior to this. So he's shown promise, but he is not anything close to a Francisco Lindor. So Lindor is my move there. I mentioned Bauer. Do you think they stand a chance at DJ LeMahieu?
I think it's unlikely. I think they would have to, because DJ LeMahieu's talking about like a 4 or 5 year deal with the Yankees. The Mets would have to fly in at probably that length, but with a much higher average annual value. I haven't seen the figures as to what exactly he wants. I imagine it's a lot. And the Yankees, it's also, I think, important to note that it seems like a lot higher of a priority for the Yankees to get DJ LeMahieu right now than it is for the Mets. The Yankees need him in that lineup. I think we've seen that in the last couple of years. He's a stabilizing presence, often comes through in the clutch. Like, they need him because he's so consistent at the top of that lineup. The Mets getting him is, and I'm not saying like the Mets are as good as the Yankees right now, but DJ LeMahieu's a luxury for the Mets. He's gravy. With all these other guys that they're looking at, with the lineup that they have, they're not factoring DJ LeMahieu into this.
Yeah, I'm with you there. I cannot imagine that the Yankees let him walk away. It would be the opposite of what they are as a franchise, and that's why this is a really exciting brawl that we have sort of primed in New York between the two crosstown rivals, because the Mets are poised to have, this is hopeful. We haven't seen anything yet, but all signs point to the fact that the Mets will have the same killer instinct that the New York Yankees have had our whole lives. And I can't even begin to imagine what that looks like for this city.